We are going to go ahead and get started. So I appreciate everyone being here today. So my name is Kristen Bett, and I'm a research analyst at the Sentencing Project. So we appreciate your gift of time to join us for our discussion today about incarceration and crime. If you'd like to use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, that would be much appreciated. We thank you for that. A couple housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar. If by chance you have questions for our panelists as we move through the discussion, please also use the chat function. We have some wonderful TSP staff working behind the scenes to moderate the chat. So they will help me with that throughout this webinar. And then once the webinar concludes, all of you will be getting a post-webinar email. And then within that email, you'll have the recording. You'll have the chat, I do believe, if I'm correct, and then you'll also have all the resources that we're going to be sharing with you today. So my colleague, Nazgul Gantanush, and I co-wrote our recent publication, Incarceration and Crime, A Weak Relationship. In this publication, we used a wide array of evidence to illustrate how mass incarceration has had a limited contribution to improving public safety. We drew on scholarly work that analyzed incarceration's role in the great crime decline of the 1990s. So as crime rates were falling starting in 1991, imprisonment levels doubled in the US from 1991 through 2009. What that research concludes that analyzed those trends is that incarceration only modestly contributed to that crime decline. We also conducted our own analysis of imprisonment and crime rate trends from 2013 to 2022. What we found was that 46 states not only decreased their prison population, but also experienced crime declines. Yet in light of such evidence, in response to pandemic-era crime upticks, we have seen rollbacks of criminal legal reforms throughout the US. So today's webinar is a continuation of our conversation about incarceration and crime to discuss better alternatives to what we're calling the 1990s playbook, right? So more prison, longer sentences, and also to learn more about crime coverage in the media. So now I'm going to switch over to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give a brief introduction to some of the work they've done, and then we'll send their full bios with the post-webinar materials. So we have Anna Flagg, welcome. So senior data reporter at the Marshall Project. So she covers criminal justice topics, including immigration, crime, race, policing, and incarceration. Her work has been recognized by the Global Editors Network's Data Journalism Awards, the Society of News Design, and the Information is Beautiful Awards. She was also a finalist for the 2019 Deadline Club Award. We have Andrew Mohammed. He is the founder, executive director, and life coach at We Ours Us Men's Movement. So welcome, Andrew. So he has substantial experience working with youth and individuals at risk for being killed or shooting someone else. He is trained and well-versed in transformative justice and techniques that include conflict mediation and resolution design. Prior to being executive director, he was deputy director of the Baltimore African American Male Engagement Initiative with the mayor's office. He worked for the Boys and Girls Club at the Baltimore Juvenile Justice Facility as the director of outreach and reentry, and also worked with youth detained in city jail. Andrew was recognized in 2020 by the Baltimore Community Mediation Center as their Peacemaker of the Year. So Dr. Alex Bacchiro, professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Arts and Sciences distinguished professor at the University of Miami, where we also hear it is very hot there. So appointed by President Biden in 2022, he previously served as the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, one of the nation's 13 federal statistical agencies. He is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in criminal careers, criminal justice policy, and quantitative research methods. He has published over 550 peer-reviewed articles and also sprinkled in a couple books in there. He is one of the most highly cited criminologists globally and has won numerous awards for his lifetime achievements, research, teaching, and mentoring. So his research, opinion pieces, and commentary have been featured in numerous outlets, too many to list here, but some such as the New York Times, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today. So Brian Widenhouse is a senior policy associate at FAM, so welcome, Brian. So Brian was given a life without parole sentence at age 17. During his incarceration, he accepted accountability for the harm he caused and chose to serve the community and better himself. He developed and managed nation award-winning projects and programs. He was the president of the prisons chapter of the U.S. Junior Chamber of Commerce, as well as an alternatives to violence facilitator, a Red Cross instructor, and a peer counselor. So after the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed life without parole sentences for juveniles, Brian was granted parole in November of 2020. He had served 31 years. Since his release, he has spoken to members of Congress, testified to legislators, and helped to develop a speakers bureau to use his voice and experiences to change the narrative of extreme sentences. So a very warm welcome and thanks to our experts for joining us today. So Dr. Picchiro, to get us started. So in response to the pandemic era crime upticks, we've seen a rollback of sentencing reforms in a number of states. So these include increasing the length of prison sentences and other rollbacks, which will result in more people serving more of their sentence. So based on your research, what does the science tell us about the effectiveness of mass incarceration, particularly long sentences, as a crime prevention strategy?
Hi, Kristen. Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here as well with you and the great panelists. And thanks to everybody who's made time this Wednesday afternoon in late July. So look, I mean, there's one thing about incarceration and there's another thing about mass incarceration. And the United States was a very good example of leading the world with respect to the number of people we put in prisons. And everybody knows about those peaks that occurred in the 1990s. In fact, in 1996, the state of California spent more money on their corrections budget than they did on their education budget. Now, some people might agree with that. I'm not convinced that that was the best strategy, but that shows you the experience the United States had. And then we started to move away from that. And in the last few years, say before the pandemic, we were at very low incarceration rates and very low crime rates. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't have crime in the United States. We still do, but we were much better off than we were in the mid-'80s and early 1990s. And, you know, when we think about incarceration, we need to think about two sets of people. And lots of people have made this analogy, but I think it's a really appropriate one. There are people we're mad at, and there are people we're scared of. The key is, who are those people and how long do we incarcerate them for? And that last question is a really important one. My research on criminal careers shows that the majority of offenders don't have 20-year sentences. The majority of offenders certainly don't have 30-year sentences. So when you're incarcerating a lot of people for a very long period of time, as the United States did with several mandatory minimums, especially with respect to certain kinds of drugs, we're incarcerating people well past the time that they would be offending. So not only are you wasting bed space in prison facilities, you're also paying even more money over the time of those individuals are in prison. So you're wasting resources in terms of facility space, and you're certainly wasting economic resources. And a lot of states went through that, obviously, in the early to mid-1990s. But that's the key thing we have to think about with respect to crime rates and incarceration. You know, since the pandemic, 2020, 21, and 22, we had increasing crime relative to 2019. Last year, and certainly the data that we've been tracking into 2024, we're now lower than we were last year, lower than we were 2 years ago, and we're starting to approach pre-pandemic levels. My worry is that we are having knee-jerk reactions to what has happened and what we're seeing on social media, and then there's a rush to have this, let's return to more incarceration. And we have to be very cognizant of the damage that did, not only to those people who are incarcerated, probably needlessly for a long period of time, but also the damage it did in terms of budgets for states. So I think we have to be very mindful of who we incarcerate and for how long, Kristen.
Thank you. So just a friendly reminder, and for those who may be just now joining us, so if you have any questions for our panelists as we move along our discussion, please put those in the chat, and then we're going to save like about the last 10 minutes or so to tackle some of those questions. All right, so thank you, Alex. So Brian, so our data analysis showed in our report that from 2013 to 2022, Louisiana decreased their imprisonment rate by 30%. and their crime rate also fell by 18% during the same time frame. Yet Louisiana, right, they've been in the news quite a bit, is one of those states where we've seen lawmakers rolling back those criminal legal reforms, including, right, increasing those prison sentences. So can you talk to us a little bit about the trends we're seeing in Louisiana, and then also some of the implications of those trends?
Yeah, so if I can put it a little bit of a perspective point of view, this decrease that began in 2013 was about the midpoint of my incarceration. I did 31 years. So I saw a lot of the system prior to this change. Louisiana for years and years had the distinction of having the #1 incarceration rate. And we're not talking about in the country, but the actual world. And when you have that distinction, people get kind of creative and hyperbolic, and it was oftentimes referred to as the highest incarceration rate in the known universe. I mean, when you're at the top, you're just at the top everywhere. And interesting enough, with the highest incarceration rate and some of the harshest sentences, we still had the highest crime rates around. So the notion that a tough justice system or tough sentencing would actually reduce crime never really played out. I don't think it's ever played out anywhere across the country. Anytime that there's a new crime trend or a crime concern, whether it's carjacking or crack cocaine, or in today's day, it's probably organized retail theft, there's always a rush to increase sentencing to make it harsher in the hopes that this is the solution to reducing crime. And for decades and decades, it never has been. And we send people to prison or incarceration thinking that not only will harsh sentences reduce crime, but they'll actually come out and be a better person. And while we've improved things dramatically in the last decade or two, we were sending people into some horrible, horrible places, rife with violence, drugs, and just simply dark, terrible, miserable places. And when they came out and recidivated, we started to increase crimes upon them, where we got things like 3 strikes laws. And so instead of asking ourselves, where's the disconnect? How come people are coming out and reoffending? We began to expound or multiply the punishment upon them as if it was their fault. Never have we really truly looked at what are the drivers of crime. I do think that we're talking, your question was the trends or the difference in shifts. So in 2013, when this crime drop started to become evident, it was a result when Governor John Bel Edwards came in and he put together a legislative session to specifically reduce the incarceration numbers in Louisiana. He wanted Louisiana not to be the highest state, with incarceration. So it was a specific goal in mind. Put together a very comprehensive package that took a lot of close looks at who could be released, who could be granted early release. One of the biggest parts, and the reason I'm here today, is part of that package was also the legislation that brought Louisiana into compliance with the Miller-Montgomery ruling on juvenile lifers. That I think last I've heard is over 130 juvenile lifers have been released. But this is a specific goal. He saw that we had dramatic high incarceration rates, but still high crime rates. And he had a specific intent on lowering that. And I think when policymakers look at crime, some people approach it from a pragmatic view of, hey, it's a problem, something that we need to address, we need to figure out. I do think when the tough on crime crowd address crime, they come at it from a different perspective. And they're not looking at it as, how do we return our citizens back to their families, their communities, whole and not recidivate. They look at it more I think, in my opinion, the views of how they see crime. I think sometimes policymakers hear the word crime and a vision comes to mind. And if I can just explain a little bit. So if I say the word dog, in your mind, you picture a dog. You don't picture a cat. If I say the word big brown spotted dog, you think a big brown spotted dog. But if I say the word crime or criminal or person who commits crime, what's the vision in your mind? I think some people have a distinct vision in their mind of somebody who's preying upon society, who's dark, dangerous, and violent, and needs to be locked away. Maybe we need a narrative shift of when we hear the word crime or person who commits crime, we envision a person who's a member of the community, who's made mistakes, who's probably suffered systemic things or inequalities, maybe some substance abuse, who kind of drove them towards crime or made them more susceptible to commit crime. And if we change how we view crime, as in what the person represents, the vision you see as a person who's committing that crime, is a starting point. And I do think the shift that we're seeing now to roll back all these amendments and policy changes that actually lowered Louisiana's incarceration numbers is simply a shift because of a vision of what crime is, and not based on crime as what the driving factors are or the systemic driving factors are. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I've also read in some news pieces that there is concern that these policy changes are going to once again bump Louisiana to being, the #1 incarcerator in the United States, and expanding the system, especially for youth if they're channeled into the adult criminal justice system.
Well,
So,
another concern is that they remove the incentive for rehabilitation pretty much. When you do away parole, when you disincentivize rehabilitation, it's not going to work out very well.
Mhm. So as a follow-up question, would you share your experiences with our audience with lengthy incarceration, and then also how those experiences have shaped your work and your policy advocacy?
Yeah, so I was 17 when I went with a life sentence, and most people, you're told you're never going to get out, you're going to die in prison, and at 17, it's pretty hard to swallow and even wrap your mind around. But I did. I went into prison with a very strong sense of guilt and remorse. I understand that my crime was severe. I hurt somebody, took somebody's life, and I owed something. I owed pretty much everything. And so I set out to be the best person I could be, to serve community, to try to help others. And I knew that if I spent the rest of my life in prison doing so, that, it was okay. It was the right thing to do. But there was always in the back of my mind hope that one day something might change, that laws would progress. Uh, as most people are wont to do in prison, they read the policies or the criminal code or procedures, and they look at things like pardon and parole boards. And the ability to get a pardon is an incentive. And part of me was like, well, I'm gonna do the best I can to become worthy of a person who would receive a pardon. Um, in the hopes that one day I could get something like that. But if not, I do want to serve my community and try to give back as much as I can. The experience is 31 years is a long time, and it's had peaks and valleys and dark days and days of hope, and seeing the best of humanity and sometimes of the worst conditions and places. People ask often, what does it feel like to have a life sentence? And a lot of times I say it feels like you're living in your grave. That perimeter fence around the prison, anything inside of it is where you live, but it's also your grave because you're going to die there. But it's a constant struggle between trying to kindle hope and do the best that you can.
Well, welcome home.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Bakiro, can I circle back to you for a moment? So, given your experience working in multiple institutions, not only in academics, but outside of academics, do you have any advice for, the change makers on how to use data in a way to influence legislation when it comes to crime and justice policy, right? To reduce mass incarceration, to move away from the 1990s playbook of longer sentences, more prison, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, there are some policymakers and, political officials at local, state, national levels who are very data driven. And then there are some who are going to cherry pick which number they're most interested in. And that's where you need a team of people, whether they're in the academic space, in the nonprofit space, or in the advocacy space, that are actually saying, here's what the data show. And, it's statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. And I think we have to be mindful of how, especially now in the current election, how certain data are going to be used. And I think, you have to advance the statement. At least this is the way I talk to people when I speak to members of political bodies. I say, look, when you go to the dentist, do you want your dentist to have read the latest dental journals? Yes, of course I do. Do you want your dentist to be trained on the best possible treatments and to make sure that he or she prescribes the right medication for your problem? Well, yes, I do. Then why wouldn't we want to treat crime data and crime policy in exactly the same way as public health? Crime is a public health issue, and we need to turn around that mentality that it's a justice issue, that's a law and order issue. Yeah, they are, but they're also people, they're also communities. And we need to make sure that the data are used for those purposes. I mean, look, all policymakers, all political officials, they have cell phones. They fly on airplanes. They love the data that goes into that, right? They trust the data that goes into that. We should be forcing the crime and justice data in exactly the same way for them so that they lead with data and not with rhetoric and gut emotions.
I'm going to do one quick follow-up now that I'm off mute. So you said to treat it as a public health issue. So what do you mean by that?
Look, I mean, the circumstances that create crime and violence, these things are education, they are nutrition, they are environmental, they're economic. All of those things that affect people's health, their physical body, also affects the potential genesis to create crime and violence over the life course. And so by putting it on a pedestal with health, I think that's very easy for people to understand that it's not just this thing over here, that it's part and parcel of the way we think about human beings day in and day out. And it's not just about people. We can be smart on crime by being smarter on people and places. And we have to remember that people act in context, whether it's in schools, whether it's in communities, whether it's in neighborhoods.
Thank you. So Andrew, I've got a few questions for you. So let's just start with, would you please be so kind, because I had to do a short bio, to tell us more about the We Are Us men's movement, and then also some of your experiences of being a life coach.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Kristen, for inviting me. But also I want to thank Dr. Alex and Bryant, man, they were some awesome answers and factual and truth. So thank you all for that information. And I'm honored to be on here with Miss Anna as well. So I'm thankful. So first thing first, We Are Us was started back in 2018. Back in 2018 in Baltimore City, Baltimore, Maryland had 309 murders. 275 of the murders was Black men, and 175 of the murders was headshots. So myself and Dr. Bunley, who are the co-founders of the movement, We Are Us men's movement, we took that data and we spent about 4 to 6 months with 2 of our team members breaking everything down on a bulletin board and finding out how we can use that data to impact Black men. And we did that inside of the mayor's office. He was the director of the mayor's office of African American male engagement, and I was a deputy director. He did all administration and I handled all the community engagement, all the training. And so we just went to work. We went to work. And what we did was, and what we found out doing our research, probably about 48 states didn't have no programs directed towards Black men inside of the local government. New Orleans had it and Philadelphia had it. And the reason why I shared that was because we all know most major cities, a lot of the crime is in the inner city where a lot of Black people live. So you would think that we would have more programs directed to, as Doc said it so eloquently, what the stats say. If the stats say 309 murders was in your city and 275 of the murders was Black men, then I need to create a program geared towards Black men. I got to find out what's going on, why Black men are killing, why are they dying in the community, particularly the 175. To get that close to one another, we found out that all of them knew each other, just doing our research. And I can go a little deeper into that, but the number one objective was, Christian, was to stop the senseless and reckless killing and shootings, because we knew through our research and us being on the ground, being in the streets, being in the prisons, being in the juvenile facilities, being in the schools, the hospitals, we knew that it was behind a lot of stuff that could have been mediated. So that's the foundation right there of We Are Us. It was built on the violence and the shooting and killing in Baltimore City.
So you also founded Baltimore Brothers, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit about that for us too?
Yes, and they kind of connect, but Baltimore Brothers is a separate youth organization. It's a for-profit organization, and what we do, it started back in 2015 during the uprising. We've been doing the work, as you mentioned before. I worked for 9 years for Boys and Girls Club down juvenile justice, where the incident rates was very high in 2009. If you look at the history, it'll tell you we went in there in 2009. By late 2010, the incident rates dropped, and mainly because of what we did. We had a team of 6 men, 7 days a week. We averaged between 4 and 8 hours a day. We was giving them real life programming, dealing with their reality. But the most important piece was when they was being released. We found out that these young men, of course, their fathers wasn't there, their parents wasn't there, their grandparents was probably raising them. They was growing up in rough environments. Wasn't no rec centers there, wasn't no men there to properly guide them. They was being recruited, by street organizations, and wasn't no positivity around them. This is what we found out doing our research as well. So Baltimore Brothers was created because my background is I was a scoutmaster as well, 15 years in Boy Scouts. And between them two organizations and the 9 years in DJS, I just found out that they had limitations and how far they could go, and that was okay. So that's one of the reasons why we started Baltimore Brothers, because not only do we service them, during school, after school, but we service them in their home, in the community, and our program has been very effective. And we teach everything from hygiene to how to navigate through the streets of Baltimore City. And as Doc said, it's really about educating them. Not just educating them with a book, but educating them about life. And then once you build that trust, over a period of time, they see you as their father, they see you as their uncle, and they start relying on you. So every interaction, every text message, every phone call, every late night call, whatever it is, getting them food, getting them clothes, getting them a job, getting them a haircut, we have to respond. And then what that does, that we put values and principles in them. And then you have a young man who we planted the seed, and now we creating a pathway for him to be a productive young man, and then also teaching him about community so he can give back to his community, because they just haven't been taught that. They just haven't been taught that. So Baltimore Brothers, man, I'm proud of both organizations. because it's 24/7 around the clock, and we hands on. We hands on, and there's nothing we don't do with them or for them, but there is some accountability, there is some discipline, there is some structure, and you know they may come in one way. They may come in with that mask on, they may come in with that hoodie on, they may come in smelling like weed, but they don't remain that way. We don't tolerate, disrespect, foul language, weapons, and once they see a responsible man and he's consistent in their life, like I said, the response is much different. And I just love to see young men being developed properly and just growing up, just enjoying life. That's some of the things that we're missing around the country when you talk about raising young Black men to become young men or to become a man, a responsible man. They have to see a man in order to know what a man look like, how he operate, and to be responsible as well. And that's some of the principles that we teach them. And they love it. The response is truly a blessing.
So I caught a question just out of the corner of my eye, because I'm not good at moderating and reading the chat, I must admit. But Maya asked, how many youth do you serve and how many staff do you have?
So man, great question. So of course, we started off with $0 forever. So for 18 years, we did this work without a paycheck. Of course, we had our own money, putting our own funds up, and some of us have businesses. But on We Are Us, we have 55 men and a few women that's on the payroll. And that took about 4.5 years. And I am the co-founder and executive director for that organization. And we doing some fantastic work. If you get a chance, you can look at us on all formats, social media, We Are Us, Facebook, IG. You can go look at our website as well. And then Baltimore Brothers, we have 9 staff members. And young men, we have 60. We take about 60 to 75 every year for 44 weeks. So if you go on our page, you'll see we just graduated. Probably about 48 of them, all of them in ties, all of them in shirts. And it was a beautiful experience. This is our second graduation. The years before, we didn't have a graduation, but you gradually grow, you see the productivity, and then you just create an environment, of excellence. And that's what we're doing right now. And so yeah, hopefully she got the answer to what I just said to the question.
Thank you. And yes, I'm glad I caught that one out of the corner of my eye. So I'm going to swing back to Dr. Bakiro just really, really quick, because you had mentioned earlier a reinvestment of resources, right? If we weren't having folks in prison for long and the punishment, et cetera. So, I mean, would you advocate for these types of programs to start proliferating to really invest?
Yeah, I mean, look, these types of programs, and I thank Andrew for the work he and his team have done. I mean, you never hear about those things. You don't never hear about the crimes averted or the shots that don't get shot. But that's the men and women who work every day in my old hometown of Baltimore. So thank you for that. We have to think about crime prevention as the following, and this is the way I think about it. We have a 15-year-old kid right now who might put a gun in his or her hand in an hour because of some social media fight. We have a 10-year-old kid who in 5 years might be that 15-year-old kid. And we have a 5-year-old kid who in 10 years might be that kid who's 15 now. So we got to think about short-term, long-term, and the right now term. So when you think about crime prevention, the kind of work that Andrew's doing is both the right now, but also sowing the seeds over time, because those kids they're going to go be models for other kids. And so you're constantly doing crime prevention, but in different kinds of ways. And it's never just one thing. People always want to go, what's the one thing I got to do? It's a lot of different things that we got to do. It's about, making a perfect cake, or you have to have the right amount of sugar, the right amount of flour, the right amount of egg. But all of those things have to come together in order to prevent crime. It's much better to prevent crime than to punish crime. And so I think that's how we have to think about crime prevention over time and across places.
All right. Thank you for that.
Kristen, can I add that,
go ahead. Yeah.
The package that we spoke of in Louisiana that reduced the incarceration numbers. So they projected, I think, over a 10-year period, like 100 million in savings. I forget the exact numbers, but they dedicated a portion of the savings to victim services and rehabilitation programming. So it wasn't just, let's reduce incarceration, let's actually be proactive in addressing crime.
Thank you for adding that, Brian. So Andrew, to swing back around, so I'm going to read a little synopsis from our report. I'm not going to do too much data heavy stuff, but so one of the things we showed in our report were youth trends. So we showed, based on the most recent data, which was 2022, because as we know, it always lags a handful of years behind. So we saw 32% fewer youth arrests in 2020 compared to 2019. So that was the year before the pandemic began. So we see some upticks in youth arrests for homicide and weapon offenses, but we also saw them go down in other offense categories. So aggravated assault and also robbery. Yet, right, we still see these calls for more punitive policies, even though we know that research shows us youth do better and they reoffend less when they're diverted away, right, rather than prosecuted. So can you talk to us a bit about how your organizations, so both of them, are better alternatives for youth versus all of the calls we're hearing for more punishment?
Yes, ma'am. And I can tell you about adults and youth, but I'll start with the youth. We have about we have a contract with the state of Maryland, and we have what they consider I would say 27 shooters. So these young men and women, and I'll define shooter for those who are not sure what I mean by that, is basically if they have been arrested and they affiliated with a street organization or have a have a history of going in and out of the juvenile facilities, of course, in our city, and probably like most cities, but ghost guns are very prevalent in our city, right? So meaning that at one point you can order a ghost gun off of the internet for $125, and they put it together themselves, use anybody's name. And so when I was growing up, we would have 20 of our guys. When I was growing up in the 80s, 2 guys may have guns out of 20, but 2-3 years ago or 2 years ago, and maybe a little, it's gotten better, but 20 guys will have guns, these young guys today in Baltimore City, because guns was everywhere. So one of the things that we're doing with these so-called shooters, we making them, not making them, but we encouraging them, inspiring them to get their education. If they need a tutor, we getting them a tutor, right? The ones that can work, we're getting them part-time work. And most of the jobs are unskilled labor jobs, but we have a program that we prepare them. It's called job readiness. So I kind of took some of the principles from Boys and Girls Club, and it's called Career Launch. It's a manual on how to teach a young man and woman to basically write a cover letter, to maintain a job, to the tire, to the the resume, etc. And we use some of them principles to teach them that, because most of them want money, right? And the way you teach them to get money is to get employment, legal employment, right? So we teach them that, how to maintain, how to get a job. Yes, please. And then the other options are, of course, hygiene, because a lot of our young men and women, they don't take baths, their clothes be sagging, they wear what they want to wear, they don't get haircuts. And then not all of them, but these are just some of the principles that we have to teach them to take pride in their very self, right? What else? So we just try to cover all the fundamentals first, the basic fundamentals to make them feel good about themselves. And then the other piece is, a lot of times our young men and women, and I'm describing these young men and women that we have, their homes are dysfunctional, right? So we have to go inside the house and find out what's going on with moms, what's going on with dad or stepdad, or if somebody there. Is the house clean? Where do they live at? Is the house they living on, is it drugs and guns in the front door and the back door? So we have to address that. So we have to address that. And then, of course, some of them have mental trauma, mental instability. We have to address that, right? Because if you can't get to the root of the situation, you're not going to get the progress that we need. And all of these different factors, once they are addressed, and then we build their trust and we start listening to them, not talking to them, not telling them what to do, the answers are right inside of them. They will tell you exactly what's wrong with them. And they really just need some help. They need somebody to prove to them that I really love you. We don't know if they've been raped. We don't know if they've been touched. We don't know if the father, the uncle, the neighbor did it, moms, you know, it's so many different challenges that they have that in order to get the best out of them that we have to deal with first. And it takes time. It's not money, it takes time. We have to invest time into them. And I'm telling you what we're finding out, Ms. Christian, when you invest in these young men, as Doc said, and women, when you invest in these young people, they are some of the most smartest young people, most productive young people. And then, I mean, we got some stories, and we've only been doing this with this program, I want to say maybe close to a year now. But it's been so rewarding because, like I said, they come in one way, but once we finish with them, it's the wrap, and it's everything is hands-on. So we got about 12 guys, life coaches, that's working with 27 clients. We call them clients, young offenders. Oh, you know, yeah. So we ain't gonna talk about that, but that's what we're doing. And as Doc said, it's not one thing. We have to address everything, and even in the house, even a community, right? But this is the icing on the cake right here, right? They know if you genuinely care or not. They know if you just want a paycheck. They know if you really love them. They know if you're sincere. Because at a certain point, they tell us everything. I learn more from them, that's what's going on in the streets, in the community, than I do because I'm in the streets. And young people, they super knowledgeable about what's happening when you talk about trends and IG and Facebook and Snap and Threads. And that allows us to get in front of everything. We have a program called Stop the Beef, where we mediate conflicts. And that's happening every week with young people. There's always something going on with them. So just because of the relationships, it allows us to save lives.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I'm gonna get a couple questions in for Anna, and then I'm gonna swing back because I saw another question in the chat that I'm gonna open up for the panel that I would like to ask. So I'm making a mental note. So Anna, thank you for being here. We're very excited to have you from the Marshall Project. So research tells us one of our main sources, when I say our, it's like, right, us as community members, the public, we get a lot of our information about crime from media consumption. We also know with that media, you don't always get all the nuances, right? The upticks, the downticks, like Dr. Piquero said, the place, right? Because that also very much matters when it comes to policy implementation. So as the senior data reporter for the Marshall Project, would you please tell us how you approach journalism about crime and justice and why these approaches are important and why they matter?
Yeah, so I think one thing in terms of our approach to journalism at the Marshall Project, something that we try to do is look with a healthy skepticism at our own prior beliefs and our accepted definitions of things. So, for instance, when we're thinking about crime and justice, those words carry really strong value judgments, right? Like in our heads, crime is bad, justice is good. But if you think about it, I'm sure all of us can come up with examples where something that was defined as a crime wasn't actually bad, and something that was defined as justice wasn't actually that good, or wasn't actually what we think of as justice. So I think it's always important in the media to be interrogating that kind of information right to the kind of foundation of the concepts and the words. And this goes back to, so I know that the Sentencing Project published these guidelines on looking at kind of crime reporting do's and don'ts. Those are really just so excellent and a great place to kind of get the foundational principles and guidance for anyone interested in these topics. But one of the things that it mentions is asking like why you're doing a particular story, like what's the value, what's the newsworthiness of this particular topic. If you're covering a certain incident of a crime that was committed, what is the news value to the reader that you're providing? Whose point of view are you sort of implicitly representing? And who is being left out? Because I think something to remember is, you know, and everyone here is aware of this, but like the criminal justice system is not niche, right? I mean, it affects almost 50% of the people in the US. Either you're directly affected yourself, or you're close to someone who is affected by the justice system. So it's always worth it to be thinking about it from the point of view of people who are involved in the justice system, and think about like what's being represented and what's not being represented. And I think audiences, especially younger audiences, are much more kind of hungry for that sort of coverage than they are for the more traditional like crime beat covering a sensational crime and like telling you like some horrible thing that happened, like, you know, and like covering one thing and not so much talking about like an overall aspect of society or aspect of the criminal justice system. And I guess the other thing that I would say, and some of the other panelists have touched on this as well, in particular when reporting on crime, usually when somebody's making a claim about crime, they're also pointing to something else that they're saying is causing the uptick in crime or causing like a downtick in crime. And at the Marshall Project, we were always really, really skeptical about that because there are so many factors that influence crime, like you guys have mentioned. So it's just kind of a classic causation versus correlation problem. And proving something actually causes an effect on crime requires a really careful study. Just citing two things that happened at the same time, it is not really enough to be like, oh, this caused the other thing. So I think we really try to look at all the factors that we can think of, like socioeconomic factors, healthcare, mental health, drug treatment, unemployment, all these things play a role in crime trends. So it's all kind of part of the picture.
All right. So with the upcoming presidential election, what advice would you give to media outlets who are covering crime and justice policy, and also to public consumers, right? Because we're gearing up. So yeah. Yeah,
for sure. This is a really important time for that. So a lot of what I personally look at involves data and trying to interpret data. And when it comes to interpreting crime data, there's, I think, a few things that you want to keep in mind. You never want to put too much stock in really short-term trends because, you know, crime data it goes up and down. Like that's just the nature of it. And so you really don't want to put a lot of stock in like one year-over-year change because it really could just be the nature of crime. You know, you want to back up and look at the overall trend. And obviously you got to be wary of cherry picking. One statistic can almost never tell you the whole story about something. So if you hear somebody repeating one number over and over again, you might want to just look into it for what's the surrounding context, what happened before, what happened after, what are the related measures, you know, just kind of digging in and not walking away after you just hear that one number. Another thing I think too is, again, kind of just about prior beliefs, like trying not to get too attached to your own prior beliefs, like as reporters or as news consumers as well. It's really important, I think. You want to be really clear about like what you know and what you don't know. And as a reporter, that's very important. You be transparent with the reader about what you know, what you don't know. You don't overstate your findings because later on, maybe they're found out to be, you know, lacking some sort of context, or maybe, you know, not even wrong, but just a bit more complicated than people realized at the time. And you never want to be put in a position where you feel kind of defensive about something that you reported or something that you believed before or something that you've talked to people about before. And you don't want to feel that pressure to be like, oh, I wasn't wrong. I don't want to be wrong. You know, like we should all be like open all the time to being corrected. You know, because that's how we all stay as correct as possible. We don't want to get attached to prior beliefs. We want to be taking in new information, and we want to be being transparent about what we know and what we don't know. Yeah, and then I guess specifically with the elections, I think people's perception of crime historically is, quite commonly out of line with the reality. And I think right now it's really out of line with reality. So people have an impression that crime really went up when it really is historically low. And retail theft is an example of that. Retail theft did not go up, but people really think that it did. Another big one, immigration and crime, that's been talked about a lot. There's so many studies, study after study, and data, so much data showing that immigration does not increase crime. Unauthorized immigration also in particular does not increase crime, but people still believe that. And, they believe that because people keep repeating it over and over and over again. So I think that it's our job to keep interrogating those claims and to keep countering them to the best of our ability.
So I've got a quick follow-up and then we'll switch to an open Q&A. So what are some strategies to counter all those narratives? Do you have any advice for, us doing the work, for other nonprofits, grassroots organizations?
I think always going to the source data is the best way to get to the bottom of anything, really. And you almost always learn something by going to the source and finding out that what you're going to find out is that it's more complicated than you thought, or than the person who told you whatever it was making it out to be. So strategy is make sure you look yourself at the underlying source information, interpret it for yourself, show it to a range of people. I mean, I kind of think about data reporting in the same way that you think about reporting in general, where you want to get a lot of sources, right? You want to see points of view across the spectrum so that you can really feel like you understand a topic reasonably fully. So those are a couple of things that I would keep in mind.
Can I add something real quick to that, Kristen? Because it was a great observation. So my research team, we were some of the first people to document the lack of a relationship between immigration and crime. We've done it in multiple different studies in multiple different cities. There are some people who are never, ever going to believe what the data show. They're just not going to believe it. So there's a bucket of people who we will unfortunately not be able to reach. But there are some people who might be reachable if you explain what the data show and what they don't show. And so sometimes people are just not going to believe what amount of data you can put in front of them on a particular issue. But there are people who are willing to listen. And so our job is, whether it's academics or those in the media, our job is to try to present the information as an objective, unbiased way as we can, in a way that's very digestible for them. And that last part is key, is how to explain to people the nuances of data. And the Sentencing Project does a great job of how it, uses data and visualizations to do just that.
We are big fans of graphics because I think it makes them easily digestible, right? All right, so we had a question that was in the chat and then I lost it. So I will try and find it again. So for those of you who are asking questions in the chat or the Q&A, I'm doing my best. So we're gonna flip into that really quick because I've got two little panels here that I'm trying to read. So one of the questions is that we've discussed ways to prevent juvenile involvement in criminal behavior. So someone asked about middle-aged adults. So what do we do with that demographic for rehabilitation and or crime prevention? So does the science direct us anywhere? Does your experiences, working in your organizations point us in any direction? So I'll just open it up for whoever would like to chime in.
I can start it off. You want to go, Brent?
Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, I can just start it off, and I'll take a few seconds. So just getting back to, going back to the root, of a young man, a middle-aged young man, most likely, if he's on drugs, he's been incarcerated, he don't have no schooling. And I'm just giving you an example. If that's, that's a lot of that takes place in the city of Baltimore. It's one or the other. And we really got to find out what his needs are. And if he need, basic ID, social security card, birth certificate, is he on drugs? Is he on fentanyl? Is he on weed? Is he on coke? Is he an alcoholic? We got to find out, put him in rehab, right? And then also, housing. Housing is a big issue. It's a lot of people, a lot of middle-aged young men going from house to house, living with their grandmother, living with their girlfriend, living in abandonments or vacants, what they call in our city. But the way we approach it is just what do he need first? What do he need first the most? What's the priority? And whatever that priority is, that's where our attention needs to be. So, because it's easy in our city to get somebody a basic job, an unskilled labor job. That's real easy for us, right? And if you just want a job, but we know jobs don't necessarily save lives, right? So if he want a job, that's great. We get him a job. But if he's on drugs, he's not going to be able to maintain that job, right? So we got to get him cleaned up first. We got to help him to change his thinking so he can change his behavior, right? And then we kind of like hold his hand, so to speak. We can't babysit him, but we got to let him know this is your reality, and you're going to have to help yourself so we can help you more, right? So it's a lot of times every situation is different, and it's based on what the needs are. So I'll just stop right there and let Brian. Hey, Brian, you may want to talk about the reentry because you just come, somebody coming home.
Actually, I'll talk on the rehabilitation angle, and not speaking on science or any kind of psychological viewpoints, but just what I saw with my own two eyes while I was in the system. So when it comes to young people who were incarcerated, they did tend to rehabilitate a little quicker and faster than middle-aged people, given the right programming and the right environment to pursue those paths and areas of growth. Given the right environment and programs, middle-aged people also I witnessed and saw change, rehabilitate, and really become the person that they need to be. But across the board, as we all pretty much know in the community of advocacy and reform, that people do age out of crime. Once they reach, older years in age, they age out of it. I don't know if it's that they get to a point where I'm tired of living like this, I'm tired of prison, I'm tired of, they age out. But because we have on one spectrum the older population who has aged out of crime and the younger population who are a little bit better at rehabilitation and reform, when we come to second look laws, we tend to gravitate towards those, either the young or the elderly, and too often middle-aged people are overlooked. And so when I try to advocate for reforms for them, I point out that when the Supreme Court outlawed life sentences for juveniles, they basically said that juveniles have a higher capacity for rehabilitation and therefore should be kind of granted some kind of second look. Well, it shouldn't matter what your capacity for rehabilitation is. It's what you do with it. If you have just the teeniest amount, but you rehabilitate yourself, you've done great. And another person can have, vast amounts of capacity and not do well. We should just be looking at people based on rehabilitation, what they've done while they're in, and try to move away from these, different extremes or various ways that we're looking at certain people. We should be looking at all people.
All right, so we're at 3:59. So I'm going to squeeze in one more question, which may be quick. Someone asked, where do lay people get the data? So I don't know if Anna or Dr. Kira want to answer, like if they were interested in trying to find some crime data so they can understand trends and patterns or something that's cited, like where could they go?
Yeah, so you can go to the federal government for statistics. Obviously, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the organization I used to be the director of, would have that information. Both, it has offending information, it has criminal justice expenditure information, it has victimization data, it's got correctional figures in terms of how many people are in various systems, probation, parole. So that would be the source for national level data, and it's federal data is official statistics. I'll let Anna add some more.
Yes, so are you, and you're talking about like NIBRS and UCR?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so for crime data, I believe that that's where you would look. And also my, I'll just give a shout out to my colleague Weihua Lee at the Marshall Project, who does so much reporting on how to interpret NIBRS and UCR, and like, because they like shifted over data collection between those two programs, and there's been a lot of issues with that. So how to best, like once you get that data, how to best interpret it accurately. If you want other criminal justice data, there's also like a ton of other sources as well. One place that I find really useful in addition to the BJS is, and I'm gonna hopefully get the acronym right, but NACJD, so the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data at the University of Michigan. So much good data there. There's also like lots of research groups that do other data collections. So I would call out the UCLA Law Behind Bars project, which collects data on deaths in prisons and jails and arrest-related deaths. There's a lot, but those are kind of the ones that are coming to my mind right now.
I'm going to shout out the Sentencing Project for our life sentence data. So we are the ones that collect that every 4 years. So we're actually going to be releasing, so Ashley Nellis, a new lifer census here pretty quickly this year. So that's really exciting. So we are at 4:02. Hopefully kept us most of the part on time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists. We greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experiences and all the work that you do. Thank you to everyone who came to our webinar today. We appreciate you, your gift of time to have these discussions with us. So once again, post webinar, you'll get an email with lots of goodies. So just be on the lookout in your inbox for that. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.